In a town where women were auctioned like livestock, the judge laughed. "Pick any wife for free." The crowd roared until the feared mountain man stepped forward and pointed. "I'll take the obese widow," he said. Gasps followed. Why would a recluse choose the most mocked woman in town? Was it pity, madness, or something deeper? Whispers spread like wildfire. No one knew that behind his silence lay a broken heart, and behind her sorrow, a hidden strength. What happened in that cabin on the mountain, and how did scorn turn into salvation? This is the story they never wanted you to hear. When a bitter laugh echoed through the courthouse and a mountain man made his choice, no one could have predicted what came next. Was it a rescue or a reckoning? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories reach far beyond one dusty town or one lonely widow. If values like dignity, redemption, and quiet strength still matter to you, then you belong here. Let me know which state you're watching from, and if this story speaks to your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Together, we keep these powerful stories alive, one truth at a time. The sky above Dry Creek hung heavy with smoke and judgment. Dust spun in lazy circles around the wooden platform outside the courthouse, where a line of women stood, eyes cast downward, skirts clinging to their ankles in the dry summer heat. They were widows, orphans, and cast-offs, forgotten souls, now branded as burdens on a town too small and too proud to carry them. Among them stood Martha Bell, her hands clenched in trembling fists, her wide frame wrapped in a faded black mourning dress that clung to her like shame. Her late husband had been a miner with a mean streak and a weak heart. He drank more than he worked, and when he collapsed on the job 3 months ago, the town offered her no condolence, only debt. Martha's cheeks burned as laughter echoed through the crowd gathered in front of the platform. Children pointed, women whispered behind lace gloves, men snorted into their mustaches. She'd eat a man out of house and home before the sun set. One barked, and a wave of cruel laughter followed. Another called, "Bet she'd crush a bed frame by looking at it." The words struck her harder than fists. Her grief had not yet hardened into callous, and every insult pressed deeper into skin still raw from mourning. The mayor stood stiffly beside the judge, arms crossed. "Can't house 'em forever," he muttered to the man in black robes. "Charity breeds idleness." The judge, a squat man with a belly like a barrel and a face carved from smugness, stepped forward. "Well then," he said, raising his voice with the lazy flair of a showman, "as a courtesy to the good men of this fine township, today's offering comes at no charge." He gestured grandly to the line of women, but his eyes locked on Martha. "Pick any wife for free." The crowd erupted. Hoots, whistles, and gasps tumbled into the open air. Martha flinched, but did not move. Her jaw set. Her eyes, though wet, did not drop. Somewhere inside her, a tiny voice whispered to stand still. "Do not run. Do not let them see the break." A lanky man in overalls stepped up and looked over the women like he was sizing up cattle. He passed Martha without a glance, stopping before a younger woman with golden curls and watery eyes. Another man joined, elbowing his friend. "I'll take the quiet one, so long as she don't cry at night." But none of them came for Martha, not until the murmurs died and the breeze shifted. He appeared at the edge of the crowd like a shadow forming from smoke, tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in a leather duster worn by time and weather. His beard was thick, flecked with silver, and his eyes were hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. Some gasped, others stepped back instinctively. Children were hushed. "Boaz Tiller," someone whispered. "The mountain man." He said nothing as he walked toward the platform. The wooden boards groaned under his weight. He stopped in front of the judge, who raised an eyebrow, suddenly unsure of his own jest. Boaz lifted his hand and pointed straight at Martha. "I'll take the obese widow," he said. Gasps rippled through the air like a stone dropped in still water. The judge blinked, mouth ajar. "You're serious?" Boaz didn't respond. He only turned to face Martha fully. She stared at him. Her breath caught. His face gave away nothing. No pity, no cruelty. Just silence, like a mountain that had decided not to fall. And then, slowly, he extended his hand. Martha looked at it large, calloused, steady. Behind her, someone laughed, sharp and disbelieving. Another voice called, "She won't last a week out there with him." But Martha, with a trembling breath, lifted her chin and stepped forward. She took his hand. The hush that fell over Dry Creek was almost reverent, like the moment before a sermon begins or a storm breaks. The laughter stopped, dying on tongues that only moments before had spat venom. Men who mocked now stared wide-eyed. Women who whispered now clutched their children closer, and Martha Bell, still standing on the rough-hewn platform beneath the unforgiving sun, felt the weight of every eye on her none heavier than his. Boaz Tiller was a name spoken in taverns and trading posts like a ghost story passed between sips of whiskey. He hadn't been seen in town in over 6 years. They said he lived alone, high in the bitter ridge, where the air was thin and the winters unforgiving. Some swore he'd killed a man once. Others claimed he spoke with wolves. But no one denied his silence or the heavy sorrow that clung to him like the bearskin draped across his pack. He said the words, once, clear and low, "I'll take the obese widow." The sound of it hit like a hammer. Martha's spine went rigid, her stomach twisted. He could have said her name. He could have left the insult behind. But no, he'd used the word the others had thrown like a stone. Obese. Widow. Both meant alone, both meant unwanted. And now he had claimed her like property, like some beast of burden he'd decided to haul up his lonely mountain. A fresh wave of chuckles rose from the edge of the crowd, uneasy and cruel. "Maybe he's gone mad up there," someone muttered. Another snorted. "He don't know what he's getting himself into." Martha didn't flinch this time. She felt humiliation crawl hot beneath her skin, but it met exhaustion, and exhaustion won. She'd fought so hard to preserve the last shreds of her dignity, endured jeers, starvation, widowhood, and isolation. Now she stood before a crowd who had branded her a burden, and a man who had chosen her for reasons she couldn't begin to guess. Boaz took one step closer. His boots struck the platform like stones dropped in a still river. He stopped, just an arm's reach away from her. There was no mockery in his face, only a firm stillness. The brim of his hat shaded his eyes, but she felt them on her like firelight in the dark. Then he lifted his hand again, not in demand, but in offering. It was a large hand, rough with scars and calluses, the kind of hand that had built things and broken things. She stared at it, unmoving. Her throat tightened, her lips parted, but no words came. Did he mean to save her? Did he mean to use her? Was this kindness, or another kind of prison? "Come," he said simply. One word. Not harsh, not sweet, just solid. She looked down at the crowd. No faces offered kindness. No outstretched hands reached for her. Behind her was nothing. Ahead of her was wilderness and a stranger. But she had been a stranger to herself ever since her husband died, maybe longer. She had nothing left to lose. Her fingers met his. His grip was strong but not crushing. Warm, grounded. She stepped down from the platform. Whispers followed them like a trail of smoke as they moved through the crowd. People parted, not out of courtesy, but fear. Boaz said nothing. He walked steadily, not slowing for her nor rushing ahead. Martha tried to match his pace, but her breath came hard and her dress clung to her legs. Still, she walked. By the time they reached the edge of town, no one followed. The sun dipped behind the hills as they disappeared into the trees, 2 shadows swallowed by the wild. One mocked, one chosen. Neither yet understood why. The path into the mountains was narrow and unforgiving, winding like a scar through dense thickets of pine and rock. Martha Bell followed Boaz Tiller in silence, the hem of her black dress catching on thorns and roots, her breath shallow with nerves and exertion. Her legs ached. Her feet, stuffed into worn leather shoes, were blistered and bruised by the second mile. Yet she did not complain. She would not give him that. Boaz said nothing as they climbed. He moved with the steady assurance of a man born to the hills, each footstep placed with purpose, each glance ahead measuring distance and threat. He never looked back to check on her, but he paused when the trail grew steep or the wind sharp, as though sensing without seeing that she needed a moment to gather herself. He offered no words, no questions, no judgment. But his silence carried weight, and Martha felt it press against her like the mountain air itself. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust him. She'd seen too much of what men could become when they thought a woman had no more fight left in her. Her late husband had started sweet and soft-spoken, then turned cruel and cold once the ring was on her finger and the mining wages came in erratic. The bruises faded, the words lingered. And now, here she was following a stranger into the woods because he'd claimed her like a stray mule at auction. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, shadows spilled across the trail. Birds fell quiet. Crickets rose up in chorus. Martha hugged her arms across her chest. The weight of the wilderness was like a second skin, vast, unknowable, and ancient. It reminded her of how small she was, how lost she could become with a single misstep. Finally, after what felt like hours of trudging through narrow switchbacks and cold air, Boaz stopped. Before them stood a clearing, cradled in the arms of two pine-covered slopes. At its center sat a cabin weathered, tilting slightly, its roof patched with tin and bark, its chimney coughing the last wisps of a dying fire. A corral stood empty to the side, half collapsed. Chickens clucked somewhere unseen. A wheelbarrow leaned against a stump, half full of wood. Boaz motioned toward the cabin with a slight nod and stepped forward. Martha hesitated at the edge of the clearing. Her eyes swept over the scene. It was no fine house, no warm hearth, but it was something, and it was his. She followed. Inside, the air smelled of cedar smoke and damp earth. The floor was swept but scarred. A small table stood near the hearth, its surface nicked and stained from years of use. Two chairs flanked it, one upright, one missing a leg. A cot with folded blankets sat near the window. Shelves lined the far wall, holding jars of dried beans, strips of jerky, and a single yellowed Bible. Boaz set down his pack and lit a lantern. Its glow softened the room's rough edges. "You can have the cot," he said simply, his voice like gravel warmed by fire. Martha glanced at him. "Where will you sleep?" He nodded toward the floor beside the hearth. "There." She didn't argue. She didn't thank him. She moved toward the cot and lowered herself with a quiet grunt, her bones tired and her heart heavier still. Boaz stoked the fire, added 2 logs, and sat down on the floor without a word. The crackle filled the silence between them. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like an old sorrow remembering itself. Martha lay back, eyes tracing the wooden beams above. She waited for fear to settle in her chest for the hand in the dark. The voice turned cruel, but none came. Only firelight, only silence, and the faint, steady breath of the mountain man who had chosen her and said nothing more. The next morning came slowly, ushered in by the gray light seeping through the cabin's shutters. Martha stirred, unsure at first where she was. The weight of silence around her was unfamiliar, no miners shouting, no slamming doors, no jeering crowds, only the rustle of pine outside and the low murmur of a breeze against the logs. She sat up on the cot and wrapped the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. The fire had died down to embers, but its scent clung warmly to the air. Boaz was gone. Her heart stumbled for a moment. Had he left her here, taken her into the wilderness just to abandon her? Her fingers tightened around the blanket, eyes darting across the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed. Her pack, such as it was, sat neatly near the hearth. The chair with the missing leg still leaned drunkenly in its corner. Then she smelled it, something faint and strange, warm, savory. The door creaked open before she could rise. Boaz stepped in, ducking under the frame, arms laden with firewood and a small sack. He set the wood down by the hearth and tossed the sack onto the table. Without a word, he moved to the fire, crouched, and began building it back up with practiced hands. Soon, the orange glow returned, stretching its arms across the cabin floor like a welcome. From the sack, he pulled out a tin of beans, some potatoes, and a hunk of smoked meat. With a small iron pot, he began preparing a meal, methodical and focused. He never glanced at her, but she could feel his awareness of her presence, as if he kept track of her breathing without looking. Martha remained on the cot, uncertain of her place in this strange, quiet rhythm. The scent of the stew filled the room, and her stomach, long used to hunger, clenched in protest. He poured the finished stew into 2 wooden bowls and placed one on the table. Then, with a nod, he motioned for her to come. She stood slowly, every movement cautious. She expected a catch, a trap, a command she'd be shamed for not understanding, but he only stepped back and took his own bowl to the hearth, eating without ceremony. She sat, took the spoon, and lifted the first bite to her lips. It was too hot, but she didn't care. The salt, the warmth, the meat that fell apart on her tongue. It brought tears to her eyes before she could stop them. She blinked fast and kept eating. He said nothing. When the bowls were clean, Boaz took them to a wooden basin and rinsed them in silence. Then he unrolled a coarse blanket near the fire and lay down on the floor without a word. Martha looked at the cot, then at him. "You're sleeping there?" she asked, her voice dry with disbelief. He didn't answer at first. Then, "Cabin's yours now, far as I'm concerned." She stared at him. Why? Still, he didn't look at her. "Because you needed it," as it tended to vary. No man had ever said such a thing to her without some price behind it. The simplicity of it was harder to swallow than the stew. She lay back down, uncertain, her thoughts spinning. She listened for any sign of shift, the sound of him rising, coming near, revealing some cruel intention, but none came. Outside, the wind had calmed. The logs in the fire cracked gently, and the warmth settled over her like a second blanket. Her body ached from the trail, but her bones felt strangely light. The cot creaked as she shifted, easing into stillness. It was the first time in weeks that Martha Bell closed her eyes without fear, and the first time in years she dreamed without sorrow. The days unfolded with the quiet steadiness of falling leaves, one after another, unremarkable in sound, but heavy in meaning. In the heart of the mountain, time did not move in hours or chores, but in rhythms, wood smoke curling into cold morning air, chickens clucking near the broken corral, boots scuffing packed dirt. Martha Bell, widow and once cast aside, rose each morning before the sun touched the peaks, pulled on her worn shawl, and began again. The first thing she cleaned was the hearth. Ashes had built up deep in its belly, layers of gray and black telling stories of meals long eaten and nights long gone. She knelt, sleeves rolled, and scooped the remains into a rusted tin pail, her hands blackened, her breath slow. It felt like a kind of mourning, but useful, like sweeping the floor of her heart. When she lit the new fire and watched the flames catch, something inside her sparked too, small and cautious. She found a broom with frayed bristles behind the cabin and began sweeping out corners thick with dust and cobwebs. She scrubbed the table, wiped the windows, beat the old blanket out on the porch. Her body ached, but her hands didn't stop. They had finally found something they could make better. Boaz said nothing as he watched. He came and went like wind through the trees, never abrupt, never hovering. When she left a pile of chopped carrots and onions by the hearth, he added a handful of dried herbs and stirred the stew. When she started scrubbing the shelves, he appeared with a hammer to fix the creaking door hinge. One afternoon she saw him mending the corral, his shirt off, his back like a corded tree trunk as he worked in the slanting light. He did not boast or explain, he only worked. In the stillness of that life, something began to settle between them. Not comfort, not yet, but a peace born of mutual labor. When she cooked, he brought wood. When she swept, he cleared brush. No instructions passed between them, no expectations, just tasks done side by side or in tandem, like two hands of the same body, learning how to move again. The smell of fresh bread filled the cabin one late afternoon, rich and golden. Martha had found a tin of old flour and, with a bit of trial and error, managed to coax it into a rough, hearty loaf. She set it to cool on the windowsill and watched Boaz from behind the glass as he mended a hole in the fence. He didn't look up, but when he came inside, he tore a piece off and nodded once before chewing. That single nod was the highest compliment she'd ever received from a man. Martha didn't ask for more. That night, she added another log to the fire without being told. Boaz brought in the last of the kindling without comment. They sat in the firelight, not speaking, but not needing to. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, soft and low. Inside, the smell of baked bread lingered in the air. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It had shape now, and warmth. In that quiet, something fragile began to grow respect, perhaps. or simply the relief of not being alone. Either way, neither of them disturbed it. The wind came down from the ridge that morning, sharp and full of pine, rattling the loose pane in the cabin window. Martha sat at the table, fingers still dusted with flour from kneading bread, her eyes distant. Boaz had gone out early to check the trap lines. The silence left in his absence was not the same hollow quiet she had known in her former life. It was clean, like snow just fallen. But even peace could stretch thin over long days, and in the lull between chores, old habits stirred. She'd found the charcoal by accident, tucked away in a cracked tin box beneath the cot. The paper, brittle and yellowed, was stacked beside it in an old satchel, with a torn strap and initials burned faintly into the leather. Martha didn't ask whose it had been. She didn't need to. Things in this cabin belonged to time, not people. She took one sheet and sat at the table, smoothing it flat with tender care. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the stick of charcoal, thick, black, and worn from age. It had been years, not since before her marriage. Back then, she used to sketch on scraps of feed sacks or the back of letters, mostly to escape the tightness of home. Her mother had called it a waste of time, and her husband had never noticed. Now, alone in a mountain cabin with nothing but firelight and pine shadows, Martha began to draw. It started with soft strokes, an outline of the cabin as seen from the edge of the clearing, the heavy slump of its roof, the way the chimney leaned like a tired old man. She shaded the trees with the side of her thumb, letting their tall forms press upward like sentinels. The path Boaz took each morning became a trail of suggestion, a whisper through the snowless earth. She did not draw herself. She didn't need to. Her presence was already there, in the careful lines and smudges, in the way the light fell through the imagined clouds. She didn't hear the door open. Boaz stepped in, brushing frost from his shoulders, and paused when he saw her, his boots stilled on the threshold. Martha looked up, startled, the charcoal still in her hand, her knuckles smudged black. For a moment, neither moved. He stepped closer, quiet as dusk, and looked down at the drawing. His eyes scanned it slowly, not quick with judgment, but deliberate, as though reading a language he had nearly forgotten. His gaze lingered on the trees, then on the outline of the cabin. Something in his face shifted, not softened, exactly, but opened, like a shutter creaking on rusted hinges. He nodded once. "You draw," he said. It was not a question, not amazement, just a fact, acknowledged. Martha blinked, unsure what to say. She looked at the paper, suddenly shy. "I used to," she murmured, "before." "Keep at it," he said, and turned to set his gear by the door. He didn't ask for another look. He didn't praise or prod. But the way he had stood still, attentive, was enough. He'd seen her, not just the lines on the paper, but the hands that made them, the ache beneath them. Later that evening, as she cleaned the hearth and he carved a new handle for the axe, she found herself glancing at the drawing again. It was not perfect. The lines were crooked in places, the scale a little off, but it was hers, and someone had seen it, really seen it. And in that stillness, something deeper than silence settled between them, a mutual knowing, unspoken and profound. The storm came suddenly, rolling down from the peaks with a fury that turned the sky dark before the noon meal was done. Wind slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters like fists demanding entry. Martha moved quickly, securing the windows and placing a bucket beneath the persistent drip in the corner. Boaz was already inside, having returned from the traps early with a sense that the weather would turn. Now he sat on the floor near the hearth, his boots drying beside the fire, his broad shoulders hunched in quiet watchfulness. Thunder cracked overhead, loud enough to shake the walls. Martha flinched and set the kettle on, needing something to do. The closeness of the space, the relentless howl of the wind outside, made it hard to breathe. Rain pelted the roof in thick sheets, each drop like a heavy footstep. She sat at the table, folding and refolding the same cloth, her thoughts pulled in directions she had long tried to forget. The storm didn't let up. The day turned to dusk without much warning, and the cabin filled with shadows. The fire glowed orange against the rough walls, its warmth steady, but inside her chest a chill had taken hold. Boaz hadn't spoken since morning, and she hadn't wanted him to. Until now, She didn't look at him as she spoke. Her voice came low, almost brittle, like something pulled from deep beneath the earth. "I was 17 when I married," she said. "My father said it was the best offer I'd get, and he was right, I suppose. At least at the time." Boaz didn't move, but she felt his presence shift slightly. Attentive. He wasn't a cruel man. Not in the beginning. Just indifferent. The kind that treats a wife like a pot he expects to keep warm, but never lifts the lid to see what's inside. She let out a humorless breath. "I tried to make it work. I cooked. I cleaned. I even laughed at his jokes when they came." The fire snapped, and she paused, watching the flames. "I got pregnant 2 years in. It was the only time he looked at me like I mattered. We picked out a name. I made a little blanket out of old shirts." Her hands twisted in her lap. "She didn't make it. Born too soon. Too quiet. I buried her behind our shack with no one but a wind-bent preacher and a cracked hymn." The cabin was utterly still, save for the storm beyond the walls. After that, he drank more, talked less. When he did talk, it was to blame me. Said my body was too weak, that I was cursed. And when he died, well, no one cried, not even me. Her voice trembled. "I thought that would be the end of it, but then the town decided I was their burden. Like losing him made me useless too." Martha swallowed and looked over at Boaz. He hadn't moved. His hands were clasped loosely between his knees, his gaze on the fire. There was no pity in his face, no revulsion, just a deep, steady stillness like a tree that had weathered every kind of storm. She waited for him to say something, to tell her a story of his own, to offer wisdom or comfort, but he didn't. Instead, after a long while, he reached over and placed another log on the fire. The flames leapt higher. The warmth deepened. That was all, and somehow it was enough. Martha leaned back in her chair, her body still aching from old grief, but the weight on her chest had lessened. The cabin still shook with the storm, but inside it, she was not alone. She was not comforted with words. She was comforted with presence. The snow had not yet come, but the air had changed. It clung to the trees in the early morning like a breath held too long. Frost rimmed the branches, and the ground crunched beneath their boots when they walked. Boaz had gone out early, rifle slung over his shoulder, not to hunt, but to check the perimeter of the land, as he did each week. Martha had stayed behind to bake and sweep, to air out the bedding and draw fresh water from the well. The rhythm of life had grown steady between them, simple, wordless, and strangely whole. But when Boaz returned near midday, he was not alone. She saw him from the window, his broad form striding from the tree line, arms cradling something limp and brown. Her heart jumped, unsure if it was danger or burden. She stepped out to meet him, the cold biting at her ankles through her skirt. As he came closer, she saw what he held, a young doe, no more than a year old, its sides streaked with blood, and its eyes wide with terror. "Snare caught her near the ridge," Boaz said, his voice low and even. "Broke free, but not clean." He carried the animal into the cabin with the gentleness of a father holding a sick child. Martha rushed ahead, clearing the floor near the hearth, spreading out a blanket and gathering what cloth she could find. The deer trembled as Boaz laid it down, its breathing shallow, rapid. A gash along its hind leg wept red into the woven threads beneath it. "I'll need to clean it," Boaz murmured, already pulling a small flask of clear liquid from his coat. "Hold her if you can." Martha knelt beside the doe, her hands firm but trembling. The creature flinched under her touch, its muscles taut with pain and panic. She whispered softly, nonsense words, soothing words, the same she had once murmured to a bundle of linen that never drew breath. Boaz worked quickly, cleaning the wound, packing it with crushed herbs, and binding it with strips of linen. The deer didn't cry out. It simply watched her with wide, dark eyes that seemed too full of understanding. When the work was done, Boaz stepped back and exhaled slowly. His hands were stained, his brow damp. He said nothing, just gave her a look, one of quiet acknowledgement, then turned to prepare a poultice. The hours passed. The deer slept. When it woke, Martha was there with water and crushed roots. She dabbed its nose, spoke gently to it. and sang beneath her breath. Days passed in a hush of care, feeding, cleaning, watching. Boaz repaired a corner of the shed so the creature could rest outside as it gained strength, but each night it returned to the cabin, lying near the fire, its sides rising slow and steady. Martha named it Hope. Boaz didn't question it. He simply nodded when she said it aloud, the name hanging between them like a candle's glow. The deer's healing mirrored her own. Slowly, its trembling stopped. It learned to stand again, to walk, to drink on its own. And Martha, too, found that her steps no longer faltered, that her hands no longer hesitated. She began to hum more as she worked. She smiled once, without realizing. One morning, Boaz found her on the porch, a sketch in hand, the deer resting at her feet. He said nothing, only stood there a while, arms crossed, the wind tousling his hair. She looked up at him and smiled small, shy, but real. Hope blinked at them both, content. Neither of them said it, but they knew. Healing had taken root in their little cabin. And not just in the creature with the wounded leg. The attic was narrow and dim, its low ceiling forcing Martha to stoop as she moved through dust and silence. Afternoon light filtered in through a small round window, illuminating floating motes in the air like drifting memories. She hadn't meant to explore, only to find another quilt, maybe some jars, anything useful now that the wind had begun its winter song. Boaz had gone to the creek to gather stones for the root cellar wall, and she was alone in the house with her thoughts and the humming hush of a quiet afternoon. The wooden ladder creaked beneath her weight as she ascended, and the air grew colder the higher she climbed. The attic hadn't been used in years. That much was clear. Cobwebs clung to the rafters, and old crates lined the edges like forgotten soldiers. A rocking chair sat in the corner, broken and buried under a faded tarpaulin. Then she saw it. Near the far wall, pushed back beneath a slope of roof, sat a trunk sturdy, wide, and stained dark with time. Its surface bore scratches and scuffs, and the iron latch at its front was shut tight with a small, rusted padlock. Something about it stopped her breath, as though the air itself had thickened. The wood seemed too still, the dust on top too settled. She knelt slowly, brushing a hand over its lid. It was cold to the touch, solid, not like a storage box, not like a place for tools or old linens. It felt personal, guarded. Martha stood and backed away, hesitant. Her chest was tight with curiosity, but also with a strange unease, as though she'd stepped into a space that didn't belong to her. When Boaz returned later that evening, his arms heavy with stones and his face flushed from the cold, she was stirring the stew and watching the fire. She waited until he had set the rocks by the hearth and wiped his hands on a cloth. Then she spoke, not looking at him. "There's a trunk in the attic," she said softly. "Locked." The room changed, not with sound, not with movement, but something shifted, like all the warmth had been pulled from the air. Boaz didn't respond at first. His hands stilled, the cloth hanging limp between his fingers. She looked up, and he was staring into the flames, jaw clenched, eyes unmoving. She tried again, gentler. "Is it yours?" His voice came low and hard. "Leave it." Martha's lips parted, but the words caught behind her teeth. He didn't shout. He didn't rise, but his stillness was louder than any raised voice. A wall had slammed down between them, invisible and firm. "All right," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "I just wasn't sure if it needed tending, that's all." Boaz didn't reply. He sat down heavily in his usual spot by the hearth and stared into the fire, his eyes haunted by something unreachable. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't companionable. It wasn't peaceful. It was thick with memory, his, not hers. She knew that now, and whatever lived in that trunk was not ready to be shared. Not yet. That night, they ate in quiet. Hope lay curled by the hearth, tail twitching in dreams. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees. Inside, the warmth returned slowly, log by log, but the space between them stayed untouched. Martha didn't ask again. But she did wonder what grief was so deep it had to be locked away. The stars above the mountain were bright that night, laid out like scattered bones across the black sky. The air was crisp but not cruel, the fire crackling in the pit Boaz had built just beyond the clearing. It had become a quiet habit between them to sit outside some evenings after supper, wrapped in their own thoughts, saying little, letting the fire speak in pops and sighs. Hope the deer slept nearby, curled beneath a pine tree, ears twitching at every far-off sound, but content. Martha sat with her knees drawn up, a blanket over her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the flames. They danced in orange ribbons, reflecting in her gaze like small, shifting truths. Boaz was across from her, one knee bent, forearm resting on it, face half-shadowed by the firelight. He had been quieter than usual all day, not the quiet of routine, but the kind that carried weight, the kind that hinted something wanted to be said, if only he could find the shape of it. She didn't press him. Instead, she watched the fire and let the silence stretch until it bent toward something deeper. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, but not hesitant. "I had a wife," he said. Martha didn't move, but her breath caught softly. She kept her gaze on the flames. A daughter, too. Her name was Annabeth. She was 4, had this wild blonde hair that curled no matter what you did to it. Like spun gold, my wife used to say. He paused, staring into the fire, as though trying to see something that wasn't there anymore. My wife's name was Clara. She liked lilacs, grew them in old coffee tins on the windowsill. Our house wasn't big, just one room with a loft near the other side of the ridge, not so different from this. His voice tightened slightly, not with anger, but memory. I was gone one night, took a job hauling supplies for a trapper 3 ridges over. Just one night, paid well. He reached down and picked up a small twig, rolled it between his fingers, the bark cracking in soft snaps. A candle tipped over. Maybe Annabeth knocked it over in the dark. Maybe Clara forgot to put it out. I'll never know. When I came back, it was all ash. The fire popped sharply, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. I found her locket in the dirt. The metal was blackened, but it was still warm. That's how fresh it was. Martha turned to him then, slowly. Her eyes were soft, steady. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. I buried them under the old pine that survived. Then I left. Came up here with nothing but that locket and guilt so thick I could hardly breathe. Didn't want saving. Didn't want kindness. Didn't want people. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw the wound not in scars, not in silence, but in the way his voice dropped to something almost broken. I wasn't there to save them. Martha felt tears sting behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She reached forward slowly and placed a hand near his, close enough to feel the heat from his skin, but not so close as to intrude. "You're here now," she said gently. Boaz didn't answer. He only looked at the fire again. But he didn't pull his hand away. The first whisper came with the trader. Boaz met him at the bottom of the ridge, same as always, twice a month for salt, oil, flour, and the rare bit of news. The man was grizzled and talkative, never short on stories, but that day his tone held something different. Urgency. Wariness. Boaz returned to the cabin with the mule heavy laden and his eyes darker than usual. "They're laying track past Miller's Creek," he said as he unloaded. "Coming fast." Martha stood at the door, drying her hands on her apron. "The railroad?" Boaz gave a tight nod. "Surveyors marked land 2 valleys over. Says they're pushing west through the foothills, past your old town." And aspiring the nowment, Martha's hand stilled. "Dry Creek?" Boaz didn't look at her, just kept stacking sacks of flour. "That's the one." Her chest hollowed at the name. Dry Creek. The place where laughter had cut deeper than knives, where a judge's voice had stripped her name to nothing and offered her like a crate of spoiled goods. Her breath came shorter, but she steadied herself. "Who's behind it?" she asked. Boaz hesitated. "Brannock." The name hit like a hammer. Mr. Lowell Brannock, the railroad man with white teeth and cruel eyes. The same man who'd stood beside the judge the day of the auction, smiling like a vulture. He hadn't just watched. He had orchestrated it, offered the terms, whispered in ears. Brannock had bought and sold lives with a grin, and now he was buying and selling land with the same hollow soul. Martha moved inside the cabin and sat at the table, the wood beneath her feeling suddenly unsteady. The fire crackled in the hearth, but she felt cold. "They'll clear the town," Boaz said, quieter now. "Burn what they need to, push out the rest. Already sent letters threatening seizure. And the people? Those who don't leave get moved. Or worse. Martha looked at the floor. Faces rose in her memory, the gossiping women, the laughing men, the preacher who turned his eyes away. She felt no loyalty to them, but some had been kind. The baker's daughter who once slipped her a fresh roll, the old woman who cried at her husband's funeral, though they'd never spoken, children who never learned the cruelty of their elders, innocence, and there was something else, a tightness in her chest that wasn't quite pity, but justice. Boaz watched her, silent. He knew. He saw it forming in her the way wind gathers before a storm. She looked up, eyes clear. They auctioned me like a mule, Boaz. Laughed when you took me. I remember. But I'm not theirs anymore. No, he said, the words solid and sure. She stood. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something old and rising. If Brannock comes this way, he'll bring ruin with him. Boaz nodded. He will. Then we won't stay silent. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't tell her to be careful. He only stepped to the door and looked out over the trees, where the sun was already beginning to sink, casting the world in bronze. Martha stood beside him. The land was quiet now, untouched. But change had begun its march. And this time, she would not be the one cast aside. Not again. The rumble of hooves on hard earth came just after noon. Martha was kneading dough when the sound reached her, faint at first, then louder, unmistakable, a pack of horses, not a lone rider. She glanced at Boaz, who was sharpening a spade near the porch. He paused, blade mid-stroke, eyes narrowing as the dust trail crested the ridge. His posture stiffened like a tree bracing for wind. Martha stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. Boaz had already stood, shoulders squared, the spade forgotten by his side. They watched as 4 riders emerged from the trees. At the front rode a man in a fine wool coat, his gloves spotless despite the trail, his face wearing a smile like a knife's edge. Brannock. He reined in his horse just shy of the clearing, the animal snorting beneath him. The men behind him were rough-looking, all leather and arrogance, their eyes scanning the cabin and its occupants like they were taking stock of a barn. "Well, I'll be," Brannock drawled, eyes settling on Martha like she was a curiosity under glass. "Didn't expect you to be all the way up here, Mrs. Bell. You've done a good job hiding." Boaz stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "She's not hiding." Brannock cocked his head, mock pleasant. "You must be the recluse everyone whispers about. I figured you'd be more bark, but here you are, playing husband in the hills." He chuckled without humor. "I'm here on business." "You've got none here," Boaz said. "Oh, but I do," Brannock said, his voice tightening. "You see, this woman here, she was never properly claimed. The town saw fit to redistribute burdens, and Mrs. Bell was left unclaimed on the public record. She was never formally married to you or anyone else. That makes her property of Dry Creek, still on the books, and by extension mine." Martha's breath caught, rage flaring behind her ribs. "I am not property," she said, stepping beside Boaz. "Not yours, not anyone's." Brannock gave her a slow, cruel smile. "You were given away for free, Mrs. Bell. I made sure of that myself. Don't think a few months in the hills rewrites the law." Boaz's voice came low and hard. "You'll leave. Now." Brannock's hand rested lightly on the pommel of his saddle. "Easy, mountain man. I'm not here for violence, just to offer a chance to resolve this before it becomes official." He turned to the men behind him. "Mark the property line. We'll be filing the claim by week's end. The land's valuable. We've got rail to lay and progress to make." One of the riders dismounted, pushing a stake into the ground just beyond the clearing. Boaz stepped forward, but stopped when Martha placed a hand on his arm, not to hold him back, but to steady him. Brannock tipped his hat, all smug civility. "I'll be back with papers, and a marshal if need be." Without another word, he turned his horse and led the others back into the trees. The sound of hooves faded, but the tension hung in the air, like smoke from a fire not yet lit. Boaz didn't move for a long time. Neither did Martha. They stood side by side, the cabin behind them, the sky darkening with the weight of what was coming. The mountain had been quiet too long. Now it would have to speak. The church bell rang, once sharp and unexpected, cutting through the noise of the town, like a blade through old cloth. The people of Dry Creek looked up from their chores and cups, their gossip and grudges, toward the steeple that hadn't called them together in weeks. Some frowned, others crossed themselves. But when the door creaked open and the long, weathered figure of Preacher Amos stepped onto the steps, they knew this was no call for worship. This was a summons. He stood tall, his white hair pulled back, his coat patched at the elbows but clean. His voice, when it rose, was clear and calm, like a stream that had never stopped running. "There is something foul in this town," he said, "and it did not ride in on a stranger's horse. It grew here, among us." The townsfolk shifted, murmured, uneasy. "You all know Martha Bell," Amos continued. "You know her story. You remember the laughter, the auction. You remember how none of us raised a hand when she was offered like a mule to be claimed or cast aside." A few heads dropped. A mother clutched her child tighter. A miner shook his head slowly. "I heard what Brannock has planned," the preacher said, "and I tell you now, this is not justice. This is not law. This is theft. This is the same cruelty we once watched and did nothing to stop, but it does not have to be who we are." A midwife near the back stepped forward, Sarah May, silver-haired and stout, with hands that had delivered half the valley's children. "I remember that girl," she said. She held herself quiet but not weak. "We let the men break her spirit and called it fate. I've had a bellyful of regret since." Others began to murmur in agreement. An old trapper with a crooked leg thumped his cane. "Boaz Tiller saved my son once in a blizzard, carried him 10 miles down a slope when no one else dared. If he's standing with her, that's all I need to know." A young widow who had once wept behind her veil at Martha's husband's funeral stepped forward too. "She held my hand that day. Didn't say much, but she stayed when others walked away. I never forgot that." Preacher Amos raised his arms, and the crowd quieted again. "We were wrong to laugh," he said, his voice heavy with truth. "We were wrong to turn away. But redemption is not only for the righteous. It is for those who choose to make things right while there's still time." He looked out at the gathered faces, not the wealthy, not the powerful, but the ones with calloused hands and quiet griefs. Midwives, widows, miners, old folk with memories full of shame and mouths long closed. "They will come with papers and power," Amos said, "but we will come with witness and word. We will stand beside what is right not because we must, but because we finally can." There was a moment of stillness, then a rising murmur of assent, not loud, not boastful, but solid, like earth shifting underfoot. And in that small town, once poisoned by mockery, something unexpected began to stir. Courage. The morning was pale and cold when Boaz hitched the mule to the wagon. Frost clung to the tall grass like lace, delicate but stubborn. The wheels creaked under the weight of purpose rather than goods, and the sky above the pines hung heavy with the hush of expectation. Martha stood on the porch of the cabin, dressed in a simple but well-mended gray dress, the one with the buttons she had re-sewn herself. Her hair was braided and pinned. Her hands were steady. Tucked beneath her arm was her sketchbook, bound in twine, pages worn from quiet hours by the fire. Boaz looked at her, eyes lingering for a moment not on her face, but on her posture, straight-backed, chin lifted. She met his gaze and gave a single nod. "I'm ready," she said. They rode in silence for the first hour, the wagon creaking down the narrow mountain trail, through stands of pine and over shallow streams turned slick with ice. Hope followed at a distance, her hooves light on the path, a quiet sentinel. The deer would turn back before they reached the town, but her presence was a comfort all the same. As the land began to level and the familiar dust of Dry Creek rose in the distance, Martha felt a tension bloom in her chest, but it wasn't fear. It was memory, worn smooth by time and reflection. She thought of the platform, of the jeers, of the judge's smirk and Brannock's sneer, and then she thought of the bread she had baked with her own hands, the wounded deer she had helped heal, the drawings that had poured from her heart and been seen, truly seen, by someone who never asked her to explain them. She thought of the firelight in Boaz's eyes the night he told her about the ones he'd lost. The town came into view slowly, its main street no grander than it had been, but different somehow, less menacing, smaller. A few heads turned as the wagon rolled in. Children stopped mid-play. Women looked up from their wash. Whispers passed like wind, but Martha didn't flinch. She stepped down from the wagon with a grace born not of pride but of peace. Her boots touched the same dirt where once she had been humiliated, but this time she walked with intention. They passed the general store, the preacher's chapel, the saloon. Faces emerged from doorways, some familiar, some cautious, others quietly respectful. A few even nodded. Preacher Amos waited by the courthouse steps, hat in hand, his eyes soft as he watched her approach. "You've got more people inside than you'd guess," he said gently. "I'm not here to guess," Martha replied. "I'm here to be heard." She turned to Boaz, who gave her a slow nod. He didn't offer words. He never did when they weren't needed. She climbed the steps alone, each footfall solid, carrying her not just into a hearing, but into something deeper, a reckoning not with law, but with her past. Inside the courthouse, she would face the man who tried to erase her. But Martha Bell was no longer someone to erase. The wooden benches groaned beneath the weight of bodies and tension. The courtroom, once dusty and seldom used, was now packed shoulder-to-shoulder miners with soot still on their hands, widows with shawls drawn tight, midwives, shopkeepers, and young boys in patched boots, fidgeting beside their mothers. The murmur of voices quieted only when the double doors opened and Brannick entered, flanked by two men in pressed coats and boots that gleamed too bright for the town's dirt. He walked with the swagger of a man convinced of his victory, nodding to the judge like they shared a private joke. When he spotted Martha seated near the front with Boaz and Preacher Amos on either side, his smile widened into something oily and theatrical. "Well," he said, sweeping his arms as if welcoming them into his parlor, "seems the whole town came out to watch a woman claim she's not what she plainly is." The judge rapped his gavel once, more for show than authority. "Proceed, Mr. Brannick." Brannick turned slowly, addressing the room like a man giving a speech he'd already rehearsed in the mirror a dozen times. "It's quite simple, Your Honor. The woman known as Martha Bell was left unclaimed following her husband's death. The town, in its generosity, organized a reassignment of burdens. She was offered, fairly and openly. The man who took her," he nodded at Boaz, "did so without legal record. As such, she remains a ward of the town, and by extension, under the purview of the expansion charter I hold for the railroad's westward progress." A few scattered gasps stirred in the room. Martha did not flinch. Brannick continued, now with mock sympathy. "I take no pleasure in these matters, but progress requires sacrifice. This is not personal, it is paperwork." Martha rose before the judge could respond. She reached into her satchel and handed her sketchbook to the court clerk. "I have something to show the court," she said quietly. The clerk passed it to the judge, who flipped through it slowly. The pages revealed scenes of the mountain homestead, the forest, the cabin's hearth, Hope curled beside a fire, Boaz mending a fence, townsfolk drawn with an artist's care clear, gentle sketches alive with feeling. At the back was a sketch of Brannick's auction, from memory. It showed a woman standing on a platform, head bowed, while men laughed and pointed. The judge looked up, but before he could speak, Amos stepped forward, a folded parchment in hand. "I'd like to present something further, Your Honor," Amos said, voice steady. "A deed signed, sealed, and conveniently forgotten, dated 3 years ago. It grants ownership of the Dry Creek public lands to the town council, under condition they not be transferred to private hands without a public vote." Brannick's smile vanished. Amos continued. "Brannick forged council signatures last month, filed a new copy in the district office, and moved to seize properties before anyone noticed. But this is the original, kept by an honest clerk who suspected foul play." Gasps rippled louder this time. One of Brannick's own men stepped back, suddenly uneasy. The judge read the deed, eyes narrowing. "This contradicts everything in your filings, Mr. Brannick." Brannick stammered, but Amos raised his hand once more. "There's more," he said. "We have testimony from the town clerk and 2 councilmen who will speak under oath." The courtroom erupted not in chaos, but in a rising chorus of whispers, disbelief turning into anger, shame into resolve. Brannick looked around, searching for support. He found none. Martha stood, her voice calm and clear. "You said I was property, but I'm not the one who's been stealing." Boaz stepped beside her, silent and firm. And in that crowded courtroom, surrounded by the people who had once laughed at her, Martha Bell stood not as a burden, but as a woman who had endured, remembered, and reclaimed her name. Justice had not only entered the room, it had come wearing the face of quiet, righteous defiance. The judge held the original deed in both hands, as though it carried more weight than paper ought to bear. His eyes scanned its contents again, slower this time, as murmurs filled the courtroom like a rising tide. Brannock stood motionless at his table, lips parted slightly, as though waiting for the moment to snap shut and call it a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was the unmaking of his empire, one line of ink at a time. The gavel cracked against the block, sharp and final. Silence followed like a held breath. "This court finds," the judge said, voice steady, "that the railroad's claim is invalid under the conditions of the original Dry Creek Land Charter." He glanced at Brannock, who now stood rigid with disbelief. Furthermore, the court acknowledges evidence of intentional deceit in the presentation of altered legal documents. An investigation will be opened into Mr. Brannock's business practices and the legitimacy of his expansion efforts across the territory. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Brannock took a half step forward, color rising to his face. "You can't—" "I can," the judge interrupted, "and I have. You are hereby stripped of any legal authority within this jurisdiction. You will vacate the premises of Dry Creek and remove your agents from the surrounding settlements until further review." Boaz stood slowly, tall as a pine and twice as unmoving. The people parted for him as if by instinct. Martha remained seated, but her hand found the edge of the bench, anchoring her as her body filled with a strange, radiant stillness. Applause began, not loud, not immediate, but like kindling catching fire. A woman in the back clapped once, then again. A miner near the front followed. Then the sound grew claps, cheers, a voice shouting, "'Bout time," until the courtroom rang with approval, not just for the ruling, but for what it meant. It meant justice. It meant she had been seen. Brannock turned, eyes wild now, but no one stepped forward for him. Even his men shifted uneasily, no longer soldiers in his cause, but witnesses to his fall. One by one, they slipped through the doors, leaving him to stand alone. Martha rose. Slowly, quietly, her spine straight, her shoulders squared. She turned toward the crowd, not to gloat, not to shame, but to meet them. The same townsfolk who had laughed when she was paraded like cattle now looked at her with something else in their eyes. Regret, admiration, respect. Preacher Amos stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Sometimes," he said softly, "God uses the overlooked to remind the proud who's watching." Boaz reached her side, his presence as steadying as always. For a long moment, the two of them stood there beneath the courthouse's high ceiling, not speaking, not needing to. Around them, the town continued to cheer, and somewhere outside, a bell rang not out of mourning or warning, but as if to mark the hour of something new. Vindication didn't come in the form of revenge. It came as peace, and peace was exactly what Martha Bell had earned. The road home felt different than the one they had traveled just days before. The path was the same ruts and stones, branches arching overhead like cathedral arms, but the silence between them had shifted. It was no longer the quiet of caution, but of belonging. Boaz held the reins as the wagon moved steadily up the slope, and Martha sat beside him, hands folded over her lap, sketchbook nestled safely between them like a treasured heirloom. The air had grown warmer in their absence. The last breath of winter had passed, and spring was creeping into the valley with soft fingers buds on the birch trees, the scent of thawed earth, birds testing their songs. It was the kind of quiet promise that whispered of beginnings. When the cabin came into view, nestled among the trees like it had always belonged there, Martha felt her heart lift in her chest. She didn't see a shack anymore. She saw a home, not perfect, not polished, but real, and waiting. Boaz pulled the mule to a stop, climbed down, and offered his hand to her. She took it, stepping onto the familiar soil with a firmness she hadn't known she carried. The porch creaked the same. The door still leaned a little on its hinge, but everything felt changed because they were changed. They didn't speak much in those first days, but there was no need. They worked with purpose, each task a conversation of motion and understanding. Boaz repaired the shed walls, while Martha swept the winter from the corners of the cabin. He chopped wood while she aired the quilts and pulled herbs from between the flagstones. Together, they built a fence around a square patch of softening soil, and when it was ready, they planted. Boaz turned the earth with steady swings of the spade, while Martha followed behind, dropping seeds, carrots, beans, squash into the furrows. She pressed the soil with gentle hands, as though tucking each one into bed. Her dress gathered dirt at the hem, her fingers blackened, but her face glowed with sweat and purpose. Boaz paused once to hand her a ladle of water from the pail, and their fingers touched just long enough to send something quiet and warm through them both. The garden wasn't large, but it was theirs. Row by row, it took shape, a promise planted in the same soil that had once seemed to hold only sorrow. On the third morning, as they stood side by side watching the early shoots begin to push through, Martha caught sight of movement at the edge of the trees. She turned. Hope stood just beyond the fence line, tall and watchful. Her wound had long since healed, her body strong again. She blinked slowly, head tilted, as though she understood what had happened in her absence. "She came back," Martha whispered. Boaz didn't answer, but a faint smile tugged at his beard. They watched as the deer stepped closer, sniffed the breeze, then turned and vanished again into the trees. She didn't need to stay. She only needed to witness. The garden rustled softly in the breeze. Chickens clucked near the shed. Smoke curled from the chimney. And inside the cabin, the morning light spilled across the table, illuminating an open page where Martha had begun to draw again, not the past, not the pain, but what came after. Roots had been planted, and this time they would hold. It started with a knock at the cabin door, timid, uncertain. Boaz opened it to find Sarah May, the midwife with silver hair and strong hands, standing on the porch with a woven basket of bread and a jar of jam. She didn't speak right away, just held the basket out and looked Martha in the eyes with a quiet remorse that needed no rehearsed apology. "I thought maybe you'd like fresh blackberry," she said at last, her voice a little rough. "And I hope you'll forgive the way things were." Martha took the basket, her smile soft and slow. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome to come in, if you'd like." Sarah May didn't enter that day, but she did return the next with 3 others, and the day after that with 6 more. Soon there were neighbors arriving daily. A carpenter brought extra nails and a bundle of shingles for the shed. A widow gifted a patched quilt. A young mother came with her children and asked, sheepishly, if Martha might teach them to draw like she did at the trial. The cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, began to hum with a gentle sort of life. The land outside sprouted green and promise, and within those walls, something just as tender bloomed: community, cautious but real. Boaz remained quiet through most of it, letting the visitors come and go without fanfare. But when a group of boys arrived with a half-whittled stick and asked if he could teach them to carve animals like the one on your porch, he didn't hesitate. He brought out the knives he'd long kept, sharp but unused, and by the end of the week, a row of small wooden rabbits, foxes, and deer lined the cabin's windowsill. Inside, Martha laid out paper and charcoal for the children, sitting at the table as they clumsily copied her strokes and created worlds from lines and smudges. She showed them how to shape shadows, how to draw movement into stillness, and more than once she caught Boaz watching her from the doorframe, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but softened. They still kept their quiet moments, early mornings on the porch, evenings tending the garden, but they had become something more than 2 wounded souls surviving the wilderness. They were part of something now, part of a circle that widened with each knock, each gift, each child's smile. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fire cracked bright inside the hearth, Martha sat on the floor with 3 children at her side, helping one draw a pine tree while another proudly held up a crooked sketch of Boaz. He grunted at the likeness, but when they weren't looking, he tucked it into a drawer. Boaz sat near the fire, carving a bird from a chunk of pine, the curl of shavings piling at his feet. The cabin glowed gold with firelight and laughter, the warmth of it pressing against the windows like something alive. Hope stood just beyond the trees, barely visible, a silent sentinel watching from the edge of the clearing. As the fire flickered and the children leaned against Martha's shoulders, eyes growing heavy, Boaz looked across the room at her. She met his gaze and smiled, steady, true, and full of the life they had built. No words were spoken. They weren't needed. They had found what the world had once denied them, a family, and this time no one could take it away.